So I hope that, I just want to share some of it with you today. I will say it is a lot. Please don't, try not to get overwhelmed, because I'm going to provide you with the slides and I'm going to provide you with a lot of other resources. And I'm always happy to do subsequent webinars. So you'll be asked to fill out an evaluation at some point for this. And if you want like a 2.0 or something, or if you want to dig into a certain element, please put it in your evaluation, and Chris and Annie and Emily will let me know. I also told Emily, Annie, and Chris to interrupt me at points. I did put things in along the way to make it a little bit interactive, but if they're burning questions, clarifying questions, or just people need to take a break from listening to my voice, just totally interrupt, that's fine. So that's who I am. The presentation, I mean, we could probably have a different title at this point. How to talk about climate change, even during a pandemic, and protests against police brutality and systemic racism. I mean, I say that because there's so much going on right now, even other than, in addition to the pandemic, that's contributing to stress, anger, sadness, all of the above. On that note, I want to recognize the recent tragedies and, frankly, the atrocities that have been committed against people of color for centuries. And NNOCCI does stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and we know that combating racial injustice is essential to our work. Communities of color, as you probably know, are disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we are committed to reviewing and revising our trainings to ensure that we provide an anti-racist learning environment and provide equitable access. So on that note, if you see things or hear things or have suggestions along the way as to how we can improve it in that respect or others, please let me know. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about today. Again, it's a lot, but it's an introduction. Happy to do more in the future, but it's really about why do we need to tell a different story, perhaps, than we've been telling. A little bit about what this NNOCCI thing is. It's, of course, another bizarre acronym. And I always think of the pasta when I hear it, NNOCCI. That's just me. So what is it, and what is strategic framing? What are the elements of the story we want to tell and need to tell, and how to stay connected? So I'm gonna see if Annie could share a quick, Annie, do we have that quick poll we can do?
Let's see, I am not seeing my poll. No, we do not.
Okay, that's totally fine. It was just to ask you all if you've heard of NNOCCI or not, and if you have, you know, kind of how familiar you are. It's not that, it was just something to, again, be a little bit interactive. But hopefully, if you haven't heard of NNOCCI, you'll get a better understanding. If you have, you know, definitely, maybe this is a refresher or builds on what you already know. So we need to start with why does all of this matter, right? Why is it needed? And a 2018 Yale study found that effective climate action requires productive public dialogue and civic engagement. And 70% of Americans think that climate change is happening, yet 65% of them either never talk about it or only occasionally talk about it. And they found that they're self-silencing because they're convinced that they have the minority opinion, and they're not confident they can talk about it correctly. So if we can empower the majority of Americans who are already concerned about climate change to start talking with their friends and families, we can start to turn the tide on this misconception and really start mobilizing for change. And we need hope. Hope promotes dialogue and action. Hopeful Americans are more likely to discuss global warming. This should say climate change. I'm surprised I didn't take that relic out of there. With their friends and family, so they actually support regulating carbon dioxide emissions and say they will act by contacting a public official, donating time or money to environmental groups, or let's say joining an action campaign. And public dialogue and climate understanding reinforce each other. So discussing climate change leads people to learn more about climate science, and knowledge of climate science leads to more conversation. which is really important, which is what we want. So what is up with this NNOCCI organization? I am going to have, I think probably stop sharing my screen, and Annie, could we queue up the video?
Yes.
The National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, known as NNOCCI, is a committed group of informal science educators who are changing the conversation on climate change. Rather than doom and gloom, they're focused on hope and civic action. Educators at aquariums, zoos, and museums facilitate millions of conversations each year, but climate conversations weren't happening because science educators were unsure of how to guide them productively in a family-oriented setting. Thanks to funding from the National Science Foundation, a partnership was formed between climate scientists, informal science educators, and social scientists to create a training program for interpreters at aquariums, zoos, nature centers, and parks. The program worked with strategic framing, an empirical approach to science translation to help interpreters in their work and in their conversations with friends, family, and colleagues. The NNOCCI program launched in 2011 and has been refined as the network grew. Program evaluations have found that our alumni develop more confidence in their ability to explain climate science, increasing their willingness to discuss climate concepts. NNOCCI language increased people's understanding of climate change, their support for solutions, and commitment to civic engagement, and we've shown that strategic framing can turn concerned individuals into active and engaged citizens. By July 2017, over 400 colleagues from 170 institutions in 38 states had joined our community, and our community is reporting consistent improvements in its own effectiveness. Using innovation, collaboration, and empirical inquiry, NNOCCI has launched a growing network of climate interpreters with tools that help millions of Americans understand why our climate is changing and motivate them to get started on solutions in their community.
Thanks, Annie. So let me just pop my presentation back up here. All right, so that is NNOCCI and what we're kind of all about. Ultimately, we want to establish a network of people who are skilled in communicating science to the American public using strategic framing, because research tells us that the way an issue is framed has a major impact on how people react to, understand, and eventually act on the information. So very powerful. And of course, we have a really lofty mission, right, which is typical of this line of work, I think. But together we want to train enough voices in proven communication techniques to shift the national conversation about climate change to be more positive, civic-minded, and solutions-focused. And you do not need to work at an informal science center to make a difference. We need to work at multiple levels. Each conversation we have is an opportunity to expand public understanding, whether it's at the interpersonal level with friends, family, neighbors, the public at large, or on an intra or inter-organization level with our colleagues and institutions. And I just want to note that this research is grounded in work on American and Canadian adults, so keep this in mind as you develop messages and programming for children. It has been found that family audiences respond very well to these communication techniques. Oops, sorry. And Frameworks Institute, which is a, they were a major NNOCCI partner, they still are. And they're a nonprofit think tank, essentially. They design, conduct, and publish multi-method, multidisciplinary framing research to prepare experts and advocates to expand their constituencies, build public will, further public understanding. And they did the cultural models research, which you'll hear about in a minute, on this work. They were, like I said, a huge partner throughout this. And they actually just released guidance on communicating climate change in the era of COVID. Actually, in April, they released it. So that's what I'm sort of sprinkling throughout this presentation. And these recommendations are based on 20 years of social change communications research, and they're there to help us adapt and respond to the unique demands of the current situation. Again, so I'll sprinkle them throughout. And the first one is actually to take time to survey the landscape so we can navigate it thoughtfully. So we need to understand that the pandemic, and when I say the pandemic, I also mean everything. The pandemic, the civil unrest, the injustice we're seeing, all of it. There's so much going on. That's currently dominating public thinking, and it probably will for some time to come. So the most important thing we can do right now is to pause and just carefully consider how, in the light of all of this, individual messages may be received. We still want to talk about all the issues and climate change, but there's not really any way of talking around or alongside these other issues. We have to wade through it all with all of our messaging. So we just want to be thoughtful about that. So where do we even start with all of this? So knowing how people think helps us construct and deliver our messages for the highest impact. So having an idea what's already in someone's head can help us craft our messaging to be the most effective. So let's try an example. These are the first 24, 26 or so images that pop up if you put ocean, the word ocean, in Google Images, a Google image search. I want you to just in the chat box, tell us some things you notice. What stands out to you? What's common? And then Emily will kind of check out what's coming in and narrate a little bit for all of us as to what you're seeing.
Cute animals. We've got a lot of blue water light, sea life. We have some waves. Ooh, pristine. No stormy days. Yes, everything looks clear. Everything looks positive.
Good.
No
Thank you,
people.
Emily. Oops, sorry, go ahead.
No, someone had said no people.
No people, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Great, thank you for doing that. This, yeah, you're pretty much right on, right? These are, there's very common themes, blue, sunny, pristine, surface, no people, very clean, not very many animals. And when there are, it's sort of that charismatic megafauna, right? Whales and dolphins and sea turtles and reef fish. So really interesting. And thank you for sharing, oops, sorry. Thank you for sharing that. This tells us something about how our society thinks about oceans. So this is an example of a cultural model, which is essentially an anthropologist term for what is already in people's heads. So they're cognitive shortcuts created through years of experiences and expectations. So to create the recommendations you'll hear about, researchers work to identify the gaps in expert and public understanding of the issue through cultural models research. They conducted one-on-one in-depth interviews with a wide range of participants across the country, varied socio-economic backgrounds, to get at all the different ways they think about the issue. And then they go through and code it and do all this stuff that is beyond my understanding. And then they identify recurring ways of thinking across the interviews, revealing these shared cultural models. So there are 4 things to know about cultural models. 1, there are multiple cultural models on any given topic or issue. 2, they are widely shared. 3, they are durable. And 4, and perhaps most importantly, relative to our practice, they structure thinking. So very important and very helpful to know what they are, if you can, on an issue when talking about it. So let's see what this looks like on the street. And if, again, Annie, if you wouldn't mind queuing up that video. And Doing that, I'll just let you all know that this is not the research
As part of a
itself.
larger, more comprehensive investigation to find out how the public thinks about carbon dioxide and its role in climate change, Frameworks researchers conducted rapid interviews with ordinary Americans in locations across the country. So let's take a look at what this looks like in some excerpts from our on-the-street interviews, a rapid response research technique that Frameworks uses to confirm and visualize the findings of more in-depth research on public thinking.
What role do you think that carbon dioxide or CO2, what role does that play in the climate?
Very bad one.
Gosh, this is awful. I should know all this stuff.
Give me a definition if you don't mind.
That's what you exhale, right? Trees absorb it.
Think of trees, like processing carbon dioxide usually.
Isn't that like the car exhaust?
The fumes out of a car.
Car exhaust.
If you leave a car on in a garage, the carbon dioxide will go inside that car.
I don't know. I think trees absorb it, we exhale it. It's not good for us to inhale, but it's good for plant life.
So what do you think happens if there's too much carbon dioxide on the planet?
That means everybody's going to die. We're going to all suffocate.
The impact, if there was a massively weight, like too much, it could impact our health in general. I don't know if too much of it could also negatively impact plant life.
I don't know. Probably like greenhouse gases or something like that.
Something about the ozone, I think.
Well, it affects the ozone layer greatly. Well, everybody's saying the greenhouse effect, global warming. It like puts a hole in the ozone.
It's breaking down the ozone. I think it's the one that's doing that. I'm not sure. I think it disrupts the ozone layer.
All right. Thank you. Just get myself situated here. Thank you, Annie, for running that. So we paused it because we're going to come back to it. So let me just pop my screen back up here. All right. So what'd you all think after seeing that and hearing that? What gaps in understanding or cultural models did you notice? And we'll do the same as before, just type them in the chat box, and Emily will tell us what she's seeing.
Nick says we're doomed. So carbon dioxide, ozone versus greenhouse gases. People don't know specific terminology. They're not familiar with the terms. People don't know what the heck is going on. They think that there's an ozone layer of carbon dioxide intersection. They're confusing ozone depletion. There are some misconceptions of basic science. And people seem perhaps embarrassed that they don't really know. Yes, carbon monoxide and dioxide confusion. Thanks, Karen. Yes, Amanda says buzzwords. People are using, quote, buzzwords known, but the knowledge is not very deep.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. You could certainly keep the answers coming in. I just, that was great. And just for time's sake, we'll move on. But yeah, absolutely. All of those things, right? I want to know like what the secret was with the ozone messaging, because that seems to have stuck around for a really long time. Anyway, yes, and I want to note that this is not the research itself, this video, but it's illustrative of the major research findings. So this was very common in the research. So we know a couple of things don't match up, right? Americans do care about climate change, but they really have no idea how it works or what to do about it. And the bottom line is, if they don't know what carbon dioxide gas is or what its role is in climate and ocean change, they aren't going to generate the productive ideas about what to do to address the problem. So, and you can see through the video what the prominent cultural models are regarding this issue. Like, it's ozone, isn't it? Or all of the above, all the things that you all mentioned. And Frameworks identified a lot of cultural models in the research for this, which are displayed here. And you will, again, you will get this information. I know this is a lot, but I put it up because this is our cheat sheet. This is what we call the swamp of cultural models related to ocean and climate change. And we call it a swamp because swamps are complex ecosystems, just like public understanding of an issue can be. But Frameworks created this complete graphic of the shortcuts that people use to process information on this topic, and it helps us decode questions and comments that we get. So like I said, it's essentially a cheat sheet for what was identified by the social science research, and the cultural models are organized under these big sets of ideas or buckets of thinking, which we call cognitive domains. And underneath each one are examples that summarize the main cultural models that people bring to bear in that domain. And they're color coded to remind us of which ones will help us or not frame our messaging effectively. So there are some in green. They are considered productive because they help people understand the cause and effects of and solutions to climate change. The yellow are just used with caution for various reasons. And then the red ones you actually want to avoid. They're considered unproductive because the public remains stuck in a predetermined way of thinking about this issue. So it's really interesting because there's so many, and they're productive and unproductive. Some are interrelated, some are disconnected, some are even in direct competition with each other in some cases, like in ocean, you have ocean support humans, but then you have, oh, they're separate worlds, you know, so it's really fascinating. Like I said, there are multiple cultural models on any given issue. And, you know, this helps us decode questions and comments. So if we hear people say, and we probably all have, why are you worried about climate change? It was so cold last winter, all right? We might not have gotten that this past season, but before that. And, you know, I would suggest that they're thinking maybe under science, like my observation's as good as yours, or what it's really just weather, climate change is weather, those types of things. And, you know, it would lead me to respond with something that explains the connection between weather and climate in a way that underscores the importance of scientific consensus, let's say. So that's just an example of kind of how we would use this. So since strategic framing works within existing worldviews instead of trying to change them, which we know is really hard to change, especially adults, it's really hard to just change their minds, right? We choose to present information in a way that activates productive cultural models that already exist so that our interactions are more productive and positive. So the elements I'm going to talk about today, values, explanatory metaphors, and community level solutions have all been proven to cue the green cultural models and quell the red ones. And one of the things I asked Frameworks about this intersection with the pandemic and other things are there any particular cultural models that are being activated even more right now during this crisis? And there are a couple, just so you're aware. The two that they notice a lot are jobs versus the environment and politics as usual. So we want to be very careful to not pit the climate crisis against the COVID crisis. So it may be tempting to search for sort of silver linings, and I'm guilty of this too. So like touting recent reductions in air pollution, but references to such upsides may appear opportunistic and will therefore kind of backfire. And worse, any talk of the crisis environmental benefits that ignores the devastating social and economic consequences is likely to reinforce an already widespread and harmful myth that economic gains and environmental protections are fundamentally at odds with one another, which we know is not the case. We also need to make a powerful case for public institutions and avoid demonizing the government. So there's this idea that our political system is broken. We can't rely on our leaders or institutions to help us solve these pressing problems. And yes, while we still need to criticize particular decisions, which is an essential communications task in itself, it is important to avoid making any sweeping negative assessments of government itself. We really need to highlight the essential role of an active and accountable public sector in confronting both the pandemic, climate change, other social issues, etc. So I'm going to pause for just a second and just ask the Wells crew, are there any clarifying questions or burning questions before I continue? Or shall I just keep plowing ahead?
We haven't gotten any questions yet, but if someone in the next, let's say 10 seconds wanted to ask a question, is that okay?
Yes, it is. And I will say that, put your questions in the chat at the time, and then I will pause again. So don't think this is your only time to ask questions. And I hope to leave some substantial time at the end for questions. So if there are none right now, I'm going to plow ahead, but I'm going to pause again. Okay. So how do we do? Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, there was one question that Nick wanted to ask. Are scientists getting more credibility nowadays thanks to the coronavirus?
I don't know that question, the answer to that question. That's a good one though, Nick. I don't know. I'd have to get back to you on that, but it's a good question. I think scientists have credibility. There's just this cultural model, and I could send you the description, the research that goes along with it, that, you know, there's a new prediction every week, and people get kind of frustrated with COVID. We were getting new information, which is good, even if it's different than what we got a few days before. We're constantly getting new information because that's how good science works, right? We're constantly refining the studies and getting new information, and maybe it is different, but sometimes I think people think that that's like wishy-washy. But that's a good question, something to look into. All right, I'm sure I didn't answer that question at all, but thank you for asking anyway. So how do we do all of this? And we really want to craft messages that engage people. We navigate away from the unproductive parts of the swamp. We inspire understanding and hope, and enter strategic framing. So it's an approach that's proven to bridge the gap between scientists and public understanding, help the public understand how this actually works, which we saw they don't really know, and to give them a sense of hope, because we know how important hope is. And this is really our core story. And because, as you could see from the On the Streets interviews, we need to tell a different story using strategic framing, because we need to help people fill in those gaps. As you can see here, these are the elements of this core story, the elements of the strategic framing. It's why does it matter? How does it work? What do we do to improve the situation? So really basic, not rocket science in the least. However, sometimes we need to be reminded of these elements of the core story. And it's important to note that these elements will strengthen any topic because they address fundamental ways in which humans think in and take information. Apart from the content of an issue, these elements work to drive people toward more systems thinking and a sense of collective responsibility. So I use strategic framing for pretty much everything, kind of these three basic elements. Why does it matter? How does it work? What do we do about it? We also want to avoid a crisis tone. And Framework's recent guidance is to balance urgency with efficacy, because it's been shown over and over again that crisis messaging does more to discourage and disengage the public than to energize or galvanize it. Especially right now, when stress levels are already high, there's a little potential for an emotional appeal to prompt a spike in public interest or concern. And even if it does, unfortunately, it's inevitably to be followed soon after by an even steeper fall. We've seen that with things like offshore drilling after Deepwater Horizon and things like that. So an effective strategy for fostering hopeful but grounded public thinking is to both acknowledge the severity of the situation, but highlight the potential for meaningful and effective public response. So we want to keep the tone inviting and explanatory rather than alarming. So we call it teaching, not preaching, right? So how exactly do we tell this story? Here are the parts of the story, and then we have this handy little toolbox to guide us through. These are the things we use, the elements that we use. You'll see we have, why does it matter? We connect with people using a value, responsible management and protection. We have different metaphors for how things work. I'm going to get into all this in a minute, and communities level solutions. So we have great materials for all of these. So the first frame element is values. They help establish why we should care. Values are enduring core beliefs, and they're the ultimate underlying motivation for a particular attitude or behavior, which is incredibly powerful. So we need to use them to connect with people. If we don't, we need to connect with them on something they care about, or else they'll just tune us out, right? We can't assume that they care about climate change for the same reasons we do. We want to try to align it with issues they care about so it's not competing so much for time and attention with other issues in their lives. And NNOCCI did research to see what sorts of values really work for most people most of the time. And it turns out that the ones that resonate with the largest amount of people and to set us up to have conversations on appropriate solutions are protection and responsible management. And we have these handy tip sheets we call reframe cards that cover each element we'll talk about today. And I will send these to you. Don't feel like you have to memorize or take a bunch of notes. But these are the type of things that we want plagiarized. These are the recommendations in their purest forms. Use them. Each of them has like the name of the element, a short synopsis of the element and the story you're telling. And then it tells you what unproductive cultural models this helps you steer clear of or redirect away from. And there's a lot more on the back. There's lots of pointers on how to include that frame element in your communications. So protection is the value that tested best at getting the most people oriented and supported of climate change. It emphasizes the need to shield people and places from harm, underscores the importance of risk reduction, concern for others, and preserving habitats. And similarly, responsible management resonated with the public, and because it stresses the importance of using common sense, step-by-step approaches to come up with responsible long-term plans that act in the interest of future generations. So those are our values. And even though I said plagiarize away, which is totally fine, know that you can also do it your way, right? There's key elements on the reframe cards that help you with what you want to make sure you include and what you might want to avoid, but it's not an absolute script if you don't want it to be. So you can raise values in many ways, and you could just use the art of language to bring it forward. It doesn't have to be difficult or wordy at all. You can just use cinnamon. Don't use cinnamon, use synonyms. Or just state it explicitly. Your opening line, or when you connect with people using a value, could be as simple as, we're committed to the protection of our people and places. Done. It makes that immediate connection with people. You can do it implicitly. You could use idioms that appeal to the value, like early bird gets the worm, problem shared is a problem halved. You can reinforce it through word choice. If you have a short amount of space for text, like in a tweet or exhibit label, you can use one word to cue up the value, like resourceful or thoughtful. You might even show an image that highlights the value. People are visual learners. You could do something like show Smokey Bear. People know what that is and what it means. So another recommendation, recent recommendation from Frameworks, is to show how this moment highlights our connections with each other in the natural world. So there's another value, it's called interconnectedness, that I learned about during my study circle. We learned about 4 values. It's now down to 2 just because they're constantly doing research and testing, and they just rose so high to the top that to just simplify things, we said those are the 2 main values. But there are others like interconnectedness and ingenuity. But interconnectedness is actually really effective right now, since we're seeing just how much we rely on each other and how much we need thriving, connected societies to deal with global threats. And we're seeing how much we need a healthy planet as well to help us get through these really tough times. So we are going to, so that was how we open and connect with people using a value. And then we're going to talk about how it works. Emily, any like quick clarifying questions before I go into how it works?
We don't have any right now.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going to plow ahead because we'll have more time at the end. But again, interrupt me if there's something. So how does it work? We do this through, explanatory chains and metaphors, and I'll tell you exactly what those mean in a minute. But this is why we need to do this. If you read that, kind of funny, kind of not, you kind of want to laugh and cry at the same time, right? So the guessing machine has consequences. Think back to our discussion around the swamp. In the absence of complete information and or understanding, humans will fill in the gaps by guessing the answers. We are not blank slates. We take previous knowledge, experience, and opinions to form new explanations. And we know from NNOCCI and other communications research that if you don't know how something works, you can easily choose the wrong explanation or the wrong solution to the problem. So poor understanding leaves us with fewer supporters for meaningful change, therefore diminishing the community of support for science-based solutions. I do want to mention researchers also found that the single most important predictor of people's intention to take action on climate change was an accurate understanding of what causes it. So since a major challenge identified through the NNOCCI research is a lack of understanding of the actual mechanisms of climate change, it's really important that we address it. And of course, back to our handy toolbox, right? So we have, how do we do this? Either through an explanatory chain, and an explanatory chain is simply a deliberately simplified step-by-step explanation of how something works, right? So we don't want to skip over parts. We don't want people to have to fill in the gaps. We want a good explanation. And if we have a tested metaphor that helps with that explanation, use it, because language is built on metaphor, and people it's really effective and people remember it. And it's kind of, we talk about a stickiness factor. And they're just simple, concrete, memorable comparisons that quickly and effectively explain an abstract or complex topic. And Frameworks has tested the ones that you see here, and yep, not a great slide, but I just wanted to show you that, yes, we have reframe cards for these as well. So there are 4 tested values. Frameworks carefully developed scientifically accurate metaphors, and they've been tested to ensure that they build a public understanding about how the issue works. And they reliably lead to stronger support for research-based policies. So thinking back to the video we saw, actually, you know what? Can we play the rest of the video, Annie, that second video?
People were unable to easily reconcile carbon dioxide's role in respiration and photosynthesis with its role in climate change. To explain the harmful role of anthropogenic CO2, Frameworks developed and tested the taxonomy of regular versus rampant carbon dioxide. This helps distinguish between the CO2 that is necessary and CO2 buildup that is problematic. Researchers read this passage aloud and then asked participants follow-up questions about carbon dioxide, as well as some of the broader causes and consequences of climate change. Let's listen to how this way of framing information about the effects of CO2 worked to help participants distinguish between beneficial and harmful levels of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, from what I'm getting, regular is just the like standard. If there was no influx of carbon dioxide, regular is just the equilibrium. It's I breathe out, plant breathes in on a cycle, and then the rampant is if two people breathe out and there's only one plant, the plant only needs the one breath. In a very, very simple analogy.
We're producing more carbon dioxide than a normal life cycle or environment would naturally, just as humans produce it and the environment consumes it, plants consume it, and it's just building up.
Carbon dioxide's a part of life. We need some of it, but we currently have way too much in the environment.
We have to find a way of lessening this rampant carbon dioxide that we're putting out.
Oh, you want to get rid of the rampant if you can, as much as possible.
More carpooling, more buses, more public transit, more bikes, just things that we can control in our everyday lives, things that are very simple that we just don't do.
Or find alternative fuels, lessen the emissions of the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the air.
There are things we need to start sacrificing and changes we need to make, or else it's just going to keep getting out of control.
The rampant carbon dioxide is just the excess carbon dioxide that we're producing that human beings weren't always producing, so it's not natural.
That there's more of it than is necessary for just normal life, not just human life, but plant life, life in general.
Naturally in the world, there is carbon dioxide, and there needs to be a certain level just to keep every process, photosynthesis and everything else we need. We are going to exhale carbon dioxide, that's going to happen. But now that there's too much of it, it's throwing the balance of everything off in the environment.
This taxonomy offers a way of organizing pieces of knowledge which otherwise might seem to conflict. Also, use of alliteration reinforces the idea that these two concepts are a contrasting pair, which helps distinguish between what is common knowledge about carbon dioxide and its role in trapping heat in the planet's atmosphere. This latter information enables thinking about impacts and consequences, including connections to other phenomena like ocean acidification. This framing tool's ability to establish a sound causal understanding and to head off dominant misconceptions likely to rise otherwise about carbon dioxide was qualitatively and quantitatively tested with nearly 3,000 Americans.
All right. Thank you, Annie. I'm going to pop this back up. So, as you could see, the interviewees kind of changed their answers after hearing that regular versus rampant metaphor, right? Which is the metaphor for regular carbon dioxide from normal life processes versus the rampant, the anthropogenic that's getting out of control. So they had, deeper vocabularies, more confidence in their voices. They freely suggested possible solutions. And so we have reframe cards for each of the metaphors. We have heat trapping blanket is sort of like the one that we spent, I think, 2 weeks in study circle just on that one metaphor. And it's a metaphor for the basic mechanism of climate change. Climate's heart, a metaphor for the role of the ocean in the climate system. One of my favorites, osteoporosis of the sea for acidification. So you choose which metaphor to use depending on the story you're telling. And we could do a whole other webinar if you want on digging into metaphors. And I'm just gonna keep going because I only have a couple more minutes and I'm hoping for a solid at least 10 minutes for Q&A and more if you want it. Last part of the story, how do we improve the situation? We do that by conveying community level solutions. So most of the solutions to climate change that dominate the airwaves are individual actions. I think we're getting better about it, but for a long time, they were focused on individual actions, many of which happen to be consumer choices like buying LED lights or buying a hybrid or buying solar panels. Every drop counts, we know that, but we want to use our opportunity to connect to people to larger scale solutions at work or community level change, because people recognize that individual actions don't match the scale of the problem. And over time, that messaging, it just leads to disengagement. So we can feel pretty confident they're going to hear from someone else that they should turn off the lights when they leave a room. We want to emphasize their role as citizens, which they're less likely to hear. So presenting community level solutions can therefore be empowering rather than intimidating. And of course, this is where we are back at our toolbox, and we have some resources on that, including, of course, a reframe card. So it really fosters hope, instills a sense of agency and efficacy. And we want to be specific when talking about solutions. So concrete examples help show how people are working together for change and give people that sense of agency. We want to explain, make the link as to how that solution helps reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Also talk about the co-benefits. There are a ton of categories of solutions at different scales across broad sectors. And since our goal is to get people thinking like citizens, we try to focus on community level actions or higher, so not individual. That being said, research indicates that focusing too large, like at the federal or international level, can maybe be disengaging because it seems a little bit too far removed from folks' lives. So more like local is better. And another recommendation from frameworks, align efforts to address COVID-19 with efforts to tackle climate change. So to avoid queuing up myths and other unhelpful patterns in public thinking, we want to focus on critical lessons we're learning now that we can apply to climate policy going forward as well. So we can highlight collective actions that have the potential to alleviate both COVID and climate concerns at the same time. For example, ensuring the federal government stimulus package puts people back to work in clean and sustainable businesses, just as an example. And while I am never one to say that you have that anything has to be long or long-winded or anything, I realize this is kind of long, but I share this because this solution was shared by an interpreter at the New England Aquarium, and my NNOCCI partner, who's the director of interpretation there, overheard him saying this to a visitor when they were talking about climate change and everything. And this, she said, I'm curious about community gardens. There are a lot of abandoned lots in my neighborhood. And I won't read this to you, and I'll send you this slide deck, but I just think this is like the gold standard, because not only did he explain how that solution helps reduce carbon dioxide, he talks about the co-benefits. Anytime you could do that is critical. It helps with adaptation by absorbing stormwater, great places for the community to come together. Gives a concrete example of a local solution and talking about how people came together to make sure that it happened. So I share that just to see, like, there's so much you can do with it to really give people hope and that sense of agency. Again, that all being said, we did find, they did some research after the 2016 election and discovered that sometimes talking about community level solutions can be polarizing. We don't want you to do a whole bunch of work to depolarize your conversation, or you'll be sent right back to the swamp at the end. So there are some language tweaks that can help you steer clear of the swamp. These are those. I won't harp on them, but this is what they found, and this will be shared with you. And so this is putting it all together. This is our story. Why does it matter? How does it work? How do we improve the situation? We tell the stories using values, explanatory chains and metaphors, and community level solutions. And really, a final recommendation from frameworks, let's frame the future. Let's help people envision where we need to go. The strongest antidote to fatalism is offering up concrete and feasible large-scale solutions as part of an overall compelling story, such as one that's strategically framed. So with that, I will say there's tons of ways to stay connected. I am happy to answer questions, be it another set of eyes on something you're working on that you're trying to incorporate framing, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know, you can ignore the top for now because I don't know how Wells wants to do their evaluation, but I do want to stop talking because I've been talking at you a lot. And we have at least 6 minutes for questions, and I'm happy to stay on a little longer if you'd like. So I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to say thank you, Jen. This is Chris. Something you may not know about Maine is that we've just finished a part of a long process to develop a climate action plan. And I'm very proud to say that many of the principles you talked about have been incorporated into the strategy documents. But the education and outreach portion of that planning process will begin this summer. So, and I'll just turn it over to Emily to relay questions to you.
Okay, so there's a question. Are there any resources you'd suggest in order to find good, concrete examples of solutions to incorporate into a climate-focused walk on the trails at the Wells Reserve?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So there are so many solutions that sometimes it's like there's so many that you can't think of one. So many. Just start collecting them. We have a solutions bank we created somewhere that I can share with you if I could dig it out. And it's just putting good examples in like a spreadsheet, and you could sort by region and sector and all of that. Anyway, like Wells, correct me if I'm wrong, ladies, but is 100% of the power that goes to most of your buildings due to the solar panels? True or not true? Nobody knows. You're on mute if anybody's trying to talk.
Karen wrote in the chat box that it's true.
Oh, okay, perfect. You could say something like that. And because that was a community level solution, because it wasn't just one person doing this, this is serving, Wells Reserve is a little mini community. It's a collective of people. So you could even talk about right there as you're walking on the trails, if you want to transition into the impacts of climate change and then end it with a solution. It could be right there. People came together, decided it was important to install solar power, and now it's offset 100% of the power at Wells. So even that is a concrete example of something that was done and you could see, and that's the type of thing that really gives people hope.
Okay, and there's another one. Karen says thank you. And Melissa Lucci asks, do you do these workshops for students who engage in their communities about climate change?
I will do it for whoever wants to listen to me. And I will say I'm certainly not the only one doing this or who could do this. I do it because I love it and because I know Wells really well. And so, yeah, but there are people who've been trained in every region on this. I'm not sure of their capacity to do presentations and things, but I'm always happy to do it and direct you to people who can. And I think even though this was originally directed at interpreters at huge informal science institutions, because a number of people they get in their interest in these issues, I think these techniques are important for everyone to know about, even if you're like literally talking to your neighbor or your mother. So I'm happy to share it with any audience. So just let me know. I have done it for a wide variety of audiences.
And this can be a question that you answer now, Jen, or a little bit later with Melissa, but she wanted to know if there was a cost associated with a webinar for the students.
No, that's the short answer. The short answer is like something like this, happy to do it. Even something a little bit longer, happy to do it. I would space it out because nobody wants a multi-hour Zoom thing. But I will say there is something called the crash course, the NNOCCI crash course, which we will send you in a follow-up email. And that is more of an intensive online, self-paced, and a couple of live interactions to really dig into this more and get feedback on it, like actually implement it and practice it and get feedback from masterful framers, things like that that do have a cost associated with it. I can send you all this information, but if you wanted just like, you know, an hour webinar, there's no cost.
And Annie will be able to email everybody the resources and the actual real evaluation that we would like you all to take. And Liz wanted to comment that the Maine Climate Council has a space on their website to request members to come give presentations at any type of events as well.
Awesome. And thank you all for the work you're doing in Maine. That's awesome. And it seems like maybe good timing with this, so please let me know if I can help. But thanks for all the work you've been doing.
So there
Okay, I was going to say, I've got that it's 2:30 now, but Jen is able to stay on if people have additional questions. And the folks at the Wells Reserve can help you connect with Jen if you'd like future webinars. I know that Jen presented a webinar to my class at UNE that was very well received. It was in person, but in the fall, colleges might be back. As you said, Melissa, you're working on that right now, but you can either contact Jen directly or work with us through the Wells Reserve. So I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today. And again, if you have additional questions, we can even turn it to a dialogue where you're allowed to talk directly to Jen. We don't have too many people, but again, please help me thank Jen for her presentation and our producer and question person for handling things today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for this. I was sorry that I came in a little late, but I found that very interesting.
Good. Did you have any questions, Marianne?
No, well, there's a lot here. I think I'll try to take it in on the things that Jennifer's sending. Certainly applies to a lot of, I work at the Department of Environmental Protection, and it certainly goes along with a lot of the social marketing we try to work into our outreach. And so I think it's good. I'm also interested in the idea of working with, you know, we're always trying to get staff that are doing a lot of outreach, trying to get them to, you know, be better about the language they're using and so on. So, and to be effective. So this is perfect. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for joining in. Hope you're not suffering Zoom overload with all the calls you're having to do for DEP.
It hasn't, today was kind of a big one, but it had a gap. So I guess I have a well to fill up again. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, and Angie, are you still there? Did you want to put your question out and just talk to Jen?
Yeah, I am still here. And this is something that I have been trying to navigate sort of in the face of our Maine Climate Council process. Chris, as you know, we've had a public outreach component as part of that. And a lot of the feedback that we got through that process was, you know, well, especially like for fishermen or people that are dependent on, you know, water, marine-based economies, this is a really sensitive time. People are just trying to worry, you know, to get by on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, we need to really approach the climate discussion carefully, given, you know, that we want to respect the really up in front concerns they're dealing with on a daily basis. So my question is more just, is there a way to sort of segue from the immediate concerns people have in their lives right now with COVID and social injustice to these broader climate change discussions? And this, you know, and I can probably come up with some examples over time. I just wondered if you had any suggestions as to how to respect the current challenges while, you know, going into the three aspects that you talked about. I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I think it's, and you don't have to tell the whole 3-part story all together all the time. You could take elements from it that may be helpful depending on the conversation. And there's something called, another thing we could do a webinar just on what's called bridging and pivoting, which is when you're talking about an issue and you feel like it's not really going in the direction you want, or it's unproductive cultural models are coming up, you would just make an innocuous statement in that, which is the bridge, and then pivot to a frame element or something that's going to help you reinforce. So, the more that people, the bottom line is the story is very powerful, the elements are very powerful. So even just connecting with that person using a value, and let's say you're in a conversation with a fisherman and you want to talk about climate change and they're just like, I don't have time to talk about that. I have bigger problems, whatever. You might say something like, yeah, relate to that, and something like, yeah, we're all, or, I respect the many challenges you have before you. What's important to understand is, and which is like a bridge statement, we all want to protect people and their livelihoods and our places. And that's just getting that value in there. And that's all you have to say, because it's found that just saying those words and making that connection is that cue that gets people in a more productive frame of mind. And then have discussions about, that's why solutions are so powerful, because then you could talk about potentially solutions that you've seen, or, you can even make them up. But I love it when they show co-benefits. If it's benefiting both the fisheries, the livelihood, the industry, and climate change, the more we can show people this is not mutually exclusive, and, mesh those together. So I don't know if that was a very good answer to your question, but it sounds like maybe if you're in a conversation and it seems to be going down the road of, don't talk to me about climate change, I've got bigger worries, like just how to make a living. There are ways, it takes practice, that you would bridge and pivot, connect with a value, and like give a solution that has multiple benefits, is one way you could do that. Does that make sense or help at all?
Yeah, that does help. And you mentioned the statement, what is important to understand is, and I think some of those key statements would be really good to add those just to my general approaches. And
I'll send you a handout. I have a bridging and pivoting handout, and it has example bridge phrases.
That'd be great.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
And Teresa, you had a question for Jen.
Hi, Jen. I do. It's been a while. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
We had also in November a large regional symposium on climate change impacts in the Gulf of Maine. And in the process that we had, we generated a lot of recommendations for priorities moving forward. And I was interested in the fact of how few people really knew of the NNOCCI educational initiative and the resources. And I got a lot of requests for help in developing like displays that could be used in a variety of different institutions or informal, say, educational centers. And it's something it seems like there's a huge need for, is, some really effective displays that could be used by a variety of different folks for their audiences. And I was wondering if there was any goal with that, and if currently NNOCCI will be continuing with your trainings, having lost the aquarium and coordination with the aquarium, if the trainings are still continuing.
Yes, thank you. Great question. We have been managing to continue on actually for years since the original grant ended. The original NSF grant was only 5 years, and we leveraged funding and different opportunities to keep it going for like 7 more years. We're still going, but it's definitely a very different model. It's more of a regional model versus a national model. So we're trying to do regional study circles and more focused training with local folks that keeps the cost down and things like that. So we have a different model. We're still doing it. COVID has definitely thrown a wrench into a lot of things. Hannah Pickard, who is the NNOCCI like goddess at New England Aquarium, it's so sad. They experienced a ton of furloughs, but Hannah is still there at New England Aquarium as a staff and helping us all try to basically keep this going in our regions with the people who have been trained and done study circles. So we are still doing things, and we are now trying to adapt for this new environment and get more stuff done virtually. So the short answer is, if you get requests or want to put my name out there or just the NNOCCI name, still continue to feel like you could do that. And then we will see what we can do. Regarding displays and exhibits, we have some great examples. I'll have to dig them up. One thing that leaves a lot to be desired is like Climate Interpreter, where all our stuff lives. There's so much stuff that it's overwhelming, and I wish there was a better system for finding it, but I'll try to dig things out. But there's a wealth of information on there, including sample exhibit, text, and design, incorporating strategic framing. That's well done.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, people in the network are also happy to take a look at things too, just to have that second set of eyes and be like, just tweak this, tweak that, you know. So don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll let you know if we can't handle it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.